So hello everybody and welcome. I'm really excited to be bringing this session to you today. I'm going to be joined today by Adom Getachew and Amandla Thomas Johnson, who've both written extensively around Black politics, Black history, and Black internationalism. So I'm really excited for this session. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to first give them both an opportunity to give opening remarks. I'm going to start with Adom, who's going to give a bit more of a general picture, and then I'm going to go to Amandla, who's going to talk to us about Prof. Toure and his work on the life of Prof. Toure. So I'm going to start with Adom.
Okay, great. Thanks, Annie, for having me. Thanks to all of you who are joining us who we can't see, but it's great to be part of this conversation. What I want to, I guess, start by saying is that the term Black international itself, I think we should recognize as a fairly new term. It's not necessarily the self-description that characters in the early 20th century would have given of themselves, and probably the term, that most associated with that earlier period is Pan-Africanism. And I think we can talk later about why and how it is that Pan-Africanism had less currency, and why and how Black internationalism as a term it emerged as the kind of, at least the way in which scholars especially identify themselves as studying something like Black internationalism. My own interest and, I guess, research is about Pan-Africanism in the early to kind of, let's say, the first 3/4 of the 20th century. I'm particularly interested in, or at least in my first book, I was interested in the period of decolonization and the ways that self-described Pan-Africanists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, Julius Nyerere, and others imagined what self-determination would require, what independence would require, and in particular their kind of internationalist ambitions and orientations around that question. So these were definitely nationalists, and insofar as they were seeking national independence and national liberation, but they always conceived of that project as an international project, sometimes even requiring the formation of regional federations, for instance, in which one would give up some form of national sovereignty. So I think decolonization for me is a kind of internationalist in two ways. Like, one, the set of figures who I study in the book came to political consciousness and political maturity, came to their critiques of empire in and through their circulation in a Black Atlantic context. And by that I mean that it was in connection and in conversation with other colonial subjects around the world that they began to formulate a critique of empire as a structure of international racial hierarchy. So just for example, Kwame Nkrumah and the Nigerian nationalist Nnamdi Azikiwe both study and spend time in historically Black colleges in the United States at Lincoln University. They're both students there, which is in Pennsylvania. And this becomes a really important moment and space for them to think the problem of empire. They begin to do, their first books are written while they're in the United States and in conversation with African-American scholars, and in involvement with Black organizations. Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, is very briefly involved in a chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization. So I think that's one way of thinking about the internationalism of these movements. It's that these are figures who are connected to each other in a global network, and it's in and through that global network that they develop intellectually and politically. And as I said, the second side of that internationalism is what their kind of ambition for a post-imperial world was. And this was a world of racial equality, of independence. It was one of creating forms of interdependence, including projects like a Union of African States and a West Indian Federation. So there is a kind of way in which their nationalism or their investment in national liberation actually is connected to a project of rethinking the world order and rethinking international relations. I'll just say one last thing before turning it over. My own work focuses a lot on politics and economics, economic critique. But I think it's important to recognize that Pan-Africanism also always had a kind of aesthetic and cultural dimension. I mean, we associate this probably most strongly with the Negritude movement, the Francophone term for a kind of cultural renaissance, spearheaded by Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor. But even in its kind of Anglophone varieties, there was deep investment in transforming the self-representation of Black people around the world. And I can say more about that later.
Thank you so much, Adom. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to turn it over to Amandla, whose book on Kwame Toure is going to be coming out imminently. But I just thought he would be a really good example of the way in which this sort of self-described Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism kind of emerge. So I'm going to turn it over to Amandla and try and see if I can spotlight you. Just give me 1 second. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Adom, thank you, Annie, as well, for the introduction. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Kwame Toure, also known as Stokely Carmichael. Some might know him as, by that name as well. And he, just to sort of jump on Adom's remarks, he sort of intersects with many of the figures that Adom mentioned, and his life coming from the Caribbean, moving to the US, and then sort of ending up in Africa, sort of typifies this sort of Black Atlantic sort of movement. The thing about Kwame Toure, however, is that he sort of goes down in history really as someone primarily involved in the Black Power movement. And what I argue in my book actually is that that framing of Kwame Toure is a very American framing. It's a very narrow framing, and really sort of freezes him in the 1960s when he's only in his 20s. He lives on for another 30 years in Guinea, in West Africa, where his politics evolve. He becomes the leader of one of the largest Pan-African parties of the 70s and 80s, and he creates links with movements beyond the sort of Pan-African frame. So just to give us an overview of his sort of biography. He's born in the island of Trinidad in 1941. The island, is a relatively oil-rich island. There's a lot of economic activity and also trade union activity. There's a big important legacy of trade unionism that is sort of burning in Trinidad, and that sort of political environment allows for a number of very important figures to emerge out of Trinidad, including Henry Sylvester Williams, who's really one of the founders of sort of the modern Pan-African movement. You have George Padmore, as Adom mentioned. You have C.L.R. James, and you have Claudia Jones, who is very relevant this weekend as she started the carnival in London, which became the Notting Hill Carnival, which would have been on today had it not been for the coronavirus. At the age of 11, Toure moves to the United States, and he becomes influenced by some of his schoolmates at school in the Bronx. Some of them, have parents who are politicized and who are sort of immersed in Marx and other European thinkers. But he also starts to mingle in Harlem with some of the remnants of the Marcus Garvey movement as well. And these are very important sort of early influences on his life. By 1960, he gets involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is known as SNCC. And this is really the radical wing of the civil rights movement, made up of very courageous students. And he rises very quickly up the ranks of the civil rights movement and is maybe second in stature, really, to his friend and mentor, Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1966, he's tired of the roadblocks put in his way by democracy and by the civil rights movement's policy of nonviolence. and he makes his call for Black power, you know, a call for organization and self-determination. And by doing so, he sort of takes on the mantle of Black militancy that had sort of been left over from Malcolm X's days, and he sort of attracts a similar sort of notoriety, you know, among white America. Despite the sort of Black nationalism of Toure, SNCC has begun to internationalize its struggle by 66. It begins to talk about the US war in Vietnam, and in 67 it comes out very strongly against Israel's invasion of surrounding countries in the Six-Day War in 67. Toure himself, his politics begin to evolve even further from 67. He goes on this global tour, you know, sort of zigzagging across the world, where he meets the likes of Castro in Cuba. He meets Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese leader in North Vietnam. He meets the Algerian fighters who are already the embodiments of Frantz Fanon's ideas. He meets Nyerere and Walter Rodney in Tanzania. He even goes to Syria, and he visits the Palestinian refugee camps, and he meets Sartre and Bertrand Russell as well. So he's you know, this is 67, 68 is a sort of global revolutionary movement, as I'm sure some of us are aware. So he's sort of part and parcel of that as well. Of course, he comes under the radar of the FBI, US authorities, and he's effectively forced to leave. His life is under threat. And he leaves to Guinea in 1969 with his then wife, the famous South African singer, Miriam Makeba. Just a few words to give some context to Guinea. Kwame Toure, as the name suggests, takes on the names of his two Pan-African icons, Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Toure. Sékou Toure being the president of Guinea, Kwame Nkrumah being the recently deposed president of Ghana. And they hold a very important place, you know, one can say, within the sort of firmament of sort of in African independence struggles. Nkrumah being the first, you know, Ghana being the first country to achieve independence in sub-Saharan Africa, and Guinea being the second. And it's important to point out, you know, the circumstances of Guinea's independence. Guinea was a former French colony, and it becomes the only one of those colonies in sub-Saharan Africa to break away, to have a full breakaway from the French community. What I mean by this is that countries like Senegal, countries like Ivory Coast maintain connections with France. They maintain, you know, for example, the currency. They up until this day, these countries still have a colonial currency, effectively. They maintain certain military, educational, cultural links to France. Guinea is the only one that really sort of fully breaks away, and it's sort of punished for that, effectively. Their sabotage, their efforts by France to destabilize it. And so when he moves to Guinea, Kwame Toure is moving into, you know, a sort of revolutionary place, but a place that is also quite isolated from the international sort of community as well. I'll just end by just mentioning the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. And this was a party that Toure led for about 30 years and becomes the largest Pan-African party, arguably, across the sort of Black Atlantic. It has a very influential base in the US, in the Caribbean, in the UK, and in Africa itself. And what it tries to do is to unite revolutionary parties on the continent to sort of move forward the sort of Black revolution. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amandla. So I guess to start with this question, so this question of interdependence, I think one of the things that people often don't realize is the extent of, you know, there's the sort of symbolic unity or African unity or solidarity. And then there are these material connections between these resistance movements, newly independent states, between sort of resistance in the global north as well. So I guess one question that comes to mind, or one thing that I was wondering if you could both speak to, is the way in which this notion of independence becomes conceptualized as an interdependent thing. So the notion that a single African state couldn't be free while all other African states were under the yoke of colonialism, or even one other African state. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, I think there's, again, a couple of ways to think about this question of why it is that independence has to be interdependent. So one is this idea, as Annie put it, that that a kind of state that was independent in the context where everyone else was not independent was always going to be a precarious situation, right? On the one, and I think there's implicitly and explicitly the 20th century conversation about Black state formation, Black independence, is really overshadowed by the experience of the kind of exemplary project of the Haitian Revolution, the first Black state to secure independence from empire. And that was already an experience of the 19th century in so far as Haiti was this isolated, independent state that was undermined, that was the object of occupation, and certainly all kinds of economic intervention throughout its life. So I think one reason why you can't have just one independent state in the context of colonial rule elsewhere is the idea that basically it means that the ideological structure of empire, which is an ideology that insists that some people can't rule themselves, remains intact, right? And insofar as that ideology and that premise remains intact, your independence is always subject to suspicion, subject to intervention, etc. So the struggle against empire had to be, in the sense, a universal struggle, a struggle that established new principles of the international order, independence, and equality of all states. There's a second reason that independence couldn't be just for one state, and this had to do with a more material and political context of these countries. So, many of these states, are carved out to be small states. They're completely dependent on and tied to a global economy. Oftentimes they produce one export good. So Ghana would be cocoa. Right? The Caribbean is kind of the exemplary instance of this, right? The Caribbean world, as C.L.R. James says, is structured fully by slavery and the sugar plantation. Those are the dominant forms in which these societies are created. So in that context, yeah, you could be politically independent. You could have legal independence, perpetually
I think we're losing you.
Dependence on a global market or metropole, then you're kind of constantly not independent, right? So this is where the project of federation, both the West Indian Federation and the Union of African States, emerges. This is the idea that we have to create relations with each other and economic and political structures that can govern ourselves as federations. And by doing this, we could gradually overcome this dependence on the external world, right? But notice that overcoming dependence on the metropoles and the global markets doesn't mean you're fully, autarkic or isolationist, because you're substituting those forms of hierarchical dependence for a more horizontal interdependence.
Thank you. So I guess I was just thinking about that and the way in which, so I guess at a theoretical, in the period of decolonization, these sort of concepts of how African states should, or Black states should begin to relate to each other are coming from a set of material questions being posed by the conditions before them. And when we think about, for example, Pan-Africanism or Black politics today, it looks very different. The conversation is very different. And one of the sort of underlying threads of having this conversation for me was beginning to see how we can bring that period into conversation with this period while being attentive to this historical specificity. And so I guess the question would then be, and you talk about this a bit in your, or quite a bit in your book, Adom, which is how the conditions have changed so much that we aren't thinking about how our states might relate to each other, and the sort of collapse of this project of world making, as you describe it, where it's not simply, you know, how do we have our independence in relation to other states, but also how do we create a world which is more egalitarian? How do we rid the world of these kind of hierarchical international relationships, but also how do we invest power back into colonized subjects and the people who are sort of downtrodden and oppressed by capital and imperialism? I forgot where I started with that sentence, but I guess where I was going with it is how totally we've fallen into this sort of neoliberal order, such that we can't even conceptualize, even in the context of these states. I mean, I'm originally from Nigeria, and I remember being in Nigeria in 2018, driving around, and I said to the person in the car with me, you know, all these beautiful buildings, extravagant buildings built by Nigerian elites. And it's really interesting in your book that you talk about Zeke, who was who was our first president. One day these people are going to realize, because the class relations are so much more sort of obvious there, one day these people are going to realize that there are more of them than there are of these people in these fancy buildings, and they're going to take over. And everyone just laughed at me and talked about how naive I was. And I guess there's a question to be had, I'm getting there now, there's a question to be posed about how we've been restructured, not simply in terms of our dependence on economic order, but also restructured in terms of how we conceptualize our relationship to power. There's a sort of general malaise or sort of despondency, such that people don't think that it's possible to change the world. So what I was wondering if you could speak to, Amandla, is like the way in which Kwame Toure manages to, throughout his life, maintain this vigor in relation to the revolutionary question, in relation to Black struggle, whilst also being constantly under the attacks and passing through all these different phases of Black struggle and the attacks from the state, and the sort of increasing inability it seemed to win.
Sure. I mean, I think what you said is extremely important, and what you see across the world is that, you know, once these anti-colonial fights have been won, you sometimes get a sort of a turn inward. So in the case of Nigeria, you have the civil war. You have once Mozambique and Angola get their independence, the liberators start fighting one another, and you know, this is in the context of Cold War rivalries. We have the era of military coups, counter-revolutions, and then we have the structural adjustments, right? And the structural adjustments, you know, through the 80s, really sort of, I think, empty the tank of any sort of revolutionary vigor, which is kind of what they're, of the sort of politics that people like Nkrumah, their big sort of state projects, you know, were sort of looking at. And I think the other thing as well is, of course, the demise of the Soviet Union. That has a big part to play in how we imagine a different world, you know, a different sort of possibility. You know, Francis Fukuyama talks about the end of history, and you know, to a certain extent, many of us sort of play into that, I guess. So, I mean, throughout this period, Toure is an interesting figure because he remains relatively rigid when it comes to, you know, to questions of Pan-Africanism, you know, to the very end. in many ways, the world is sort of changing around him, but he sort of remains, quite, adamant that Africans need to sort of, think about unity, in sort of different ways, and obviously, key to that is the economic question. But the problem is that the economic question is moving in a completely different direction from where he sort of wants it to go. So that for me was like a sort of core tension in his work, and it's sort of been raised before. How do you what do you do within the sort of neoliberal paradigm when you believe that the revolutionary struggle to be sort of eternal? You believe in sort of scientific principles of socialism, and that's something that I think led to, in some ways, his sort of discarding from the scene. If you look at some of the comments that Barack Obama sort of said about Kwame Toure, he mentioned Kwame Toure coming to deliver a talk at his university, and he sort of said that I couldn't. Everything he said was, out of this world. I couldn't really relate to anything he was saying and all this sort of stuff. And so there is this disconnect that is sort of taking place. That we have a generation of people who are not born within that sort of revolutionary sort of generation, and people who have sort of invested in the sort of neoliberal paradigm. And then you have people who are still coming from a more traditional Pan-African sort of position. And how the two interrelate is something which is, I think, it's still an open question.
Yeah, definitely. And Adom, you talk in your book about your book about the new economic order, and I guess one thing that was interesting for me to see is the way in which a critique of imperialism and a critique of colonization leads all of these revolutionaries, leads these statesmen towards also a critique of capitalism as structuring the world in this fundamentally unequal way. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned this earlier vis-a-vis CLR James, but I think, for many of these thinkers, the starting moment, the founding moment of the modern world is the plantation, and it's the Caribbean. And if you think about the world as modern world as a kind of inheriting the structures of the plantation system set up in the beginning century, I think there isn't a way that you don't end up with some form of a critique of capitalism. This is, of course, famously the thesis also of Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. It reoccurs in Du Bois's writings of the 30s, and of course in CLR James's Black Jacobins as well. I think, though, there is and this goes to what Amandla was saying about a shifting kind of context and conditions for critique and transformation. So the NIEO does have a critique of capitalism, but it is not necessarily it's not a socialist project. It's not a project of world revolution. It's a project of social democracy for the world. It's as I think in the book, it's a vision of trying to internationalize the welfare state. So that means that already by the 1970s, that vision, the 30s vision that Padmore had when he joined the Communist International, that CLR James had when he wrote World Revolution, the conditions for even that form of kind of workers of the world unite and overcome capital does not quite exist in the same way, even in this period of the 60s and 70s of decolonization. And there's many reasons why that is the case. I think one is about the position of the Soviet Union, which by the 23, I think, has abandoned the project of world revolution for a policy of socialism in one country, and has sidelined, anti-colonial activists like Padmore and other Black communists who get kicked out of the party. so I think that the kind of, I would think, the 20s and 30s are this moment of really thinking the question of revolution and a wholesale kind of rupture with the capitalist world order. But I think the new international economic order, from where we sit, is a radical project, and it has this egalitarian ambition, but its reference point is no longer, it's an attempt to moderate and regulate capitalism, not an attempt to overcome it. And a lot of Marxists would critique the NIEO on these bases. So for instance, I reference Samir Amin, an Egyptian economist who started Cadastria in Dakar, a kind of think tank for thinking economic policy and social policy for the African continent. And a radical all his life, was very critical of the NIEO for this very reason. I think in terms of just like what the sort of lessons for our own time are, I wanted to go back to your question, Amandla, earlier and say, I think my book focuses on states and the relations between states because it's this period of decolonization, but that's not where most of, that's not where the politics began, right? Like it began in non-state formations, like the kind of party that Toure was, that Amandla was describing, that Toure started. It started in, these congresses, transnational formations. And so I think it's true that when you look at the world of states, including the world of African states, it's not much to be excited about. But in terms of like other kinds of political formations that are non-state, I think there's lots of things to be excited about and to feel hope that, under the right conditions and the right context, that there could be forms of transformation for these projects.
Definitely. And I mean, I wasn't trying to be too pessimistic. I was going to also invite you both to sort of speak on some of the struggles that are happening at the moment. I guess the position that I was coming from is one, sort of seeing that, that was my sort of entry point into African politics, was speaking with my family as a child about like what was going on in Nigeria and corruption, the like perennial problem. I came to understand that I came to understand Nigerian politics through that lens of like bad leaders, corrupt politicians. And then it was only as I sort of became radicalized later on in life that I started to think about it through a different lens. I guess there was that sort of thrust behind the question, but then also the other thrust was seeing how, if you're looking at political formations of the late 60s, early 70s globally, the kind of struggles that were happening in Vietnam, but also the kind of struggles that are happening across the African continent, the kind of struggles that are happening across South Asia, was something that all revolutionaries around the world found it their duty to educate themselves on, right? Whereas we find ourselves in a moment, and I guess I've talked quite a bit in previous iterations of the series about how we've sort of retreated into the national, where today, if you ask someone about a struggle that was happening, or to name a struggle that's happening not in the UK or the US, most people will find it very difficult. So I guess whereas we live in a world in which people understand themselves as far more integrated into a global world where distance is seen as far shorter, but we only really see struggles on the African continent in like brief moments of eruption. And actually, just as I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about this speech video clip I watched a while back from Kwame Toure, where he's talking about how we have to be careful not to be locked into this cycle of mobilization over organization. And one of the things that I'm beginning to think is happening in this moment is we are seeing lots of mobilization, but it's not organized as a struggle with a clear sense of what the enemy is or who the enemy is. And I'm thinking about that in relation to the way in which, I mean, in the African liberation readers, there's like this pretty extensive section on like how to relate to other national liberation struggles and answering very important strategic questions. And those questions all come from the standpoint of seeing it as a singular struggle, as opposed to seeing it as these sort of localized national battles. And then once we sort out the national, then we think about the international. And I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah. Can I go? Yes, I think you raised some very important points. And what I find fascinating about Kwame Toure is that he keeps alive the optimism of looking at things globally well into the 90s. There's a saying within the ranks of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is Africans first, but others also, basically. And that, in a nutshell, basically encapsulates their idea that the African struggle is part of a much wider sort of global struggle. And what you see of the party is that it enters into hundreds of alliances with groups from across the world, not just those which pertain directly to Black struggle. I've got a list somewhere, and I'll read a few names. There's Sinn Féin, there's the Workers' Party of Korea, there's a Polisario Front in Western Sahara, there's the American Indian Movement, there's a Black Consciousness Movement of Brazil, the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, there's a Hackney Black People's Association in London, and they're making links with with Dalit groups in India as well. And one of the interesting things really about Toure, and again this has really been erased from his sort of biography, is the extent to which he was such a vocal supporter of the rights of Palestinians. From in the late 60s, when SNCC came out so strongly against Israel's attack against surrounding countries in the '67 war, this was a watershed moment in sort of American politics, because it was really the first time that a civil rights movement had come out to attack Israel and come out in support of Palestinian rights. And Toure continues that trajectory for the next 30 years. And it's important to understand how he sort of encapsulates, how he sort of theorizes about Israel and about Palestine. So he sees Israel as an outpost of American imperialism, right? Its support for apartheid South Africa, and its invasion and occupation of parts of Egypt in the '67 war. He views that as actually a direct attack on Africa itself, right? Palestine for him, in his words, he sees as the tip of Africa. So he's sort of, in some ways, you can sort of see the the sort of residues of sort of X and Fanon talking about sort of Black and Arab sort of solidarity. You can sort of see some of that in how Toure theorizes about Palestine. He meets with PLO officials in '79, and he keeps up a very lively correspondence with the Afro-Palestinian militant Fatima Benawi. And Palestine and Israel are a very popular topic when he comes to the US each year to give his speeches at various universities. And it leads to accusations of anti-Semitism. He's very much involved in that sort of context. What's so fascinating is that in 1990, all the way 1990, when Africa has been tipped upside down, the Soviet Union is crumbling. He founds something called the Worldwide African Anti-Zionist Front, and he brings together organizations from 4 continents to form this coalition, which he wants to call for boycotts, but also to isolate African leaders with Zionist connections. And some of the names there are the South African organizations. There's a Pan-African Union in Sierra Leone, which is quite a significant group. There's a Black Movement of Brazil. There's Indigenous Peoples of South America, which is in Bolivia. There's an Antiguan group there, and there's also Dalit Voice, the largest publication focused on India's discriminated lower castes. And for Toure, he sees African people as a sort of global vanguard of revolution, which is why he sort of brings these groups together across the Black Atlantic mainly for a cause which is actually outside of Africa. And that's really what I find so fascinating, that he's bringing together groups in a Pan-African geography for a cause outside of the continent. And I think that really challenges how we speak about solidarity today. For him, for Toure, whether it's Palestine, whether it's the dialects of India, it's part of the same global sort of network of oppression. And he's positioned himself as someone who can, who is reasoned that in a much wider way than I think we tend to look at these struggles today.
Yeah, I guess I will just add very quickly that I think one of the most incredible things about studying the early 20th century and these figures is exactly what you said, Annie. Like, we tell ourselves we live in a globalized world, but these folks are like traveling and connected in ways that we can't fully imagine, or just that seems so surprising for a moment in which they don't have the technologies of communication and mobility that we might have. But I just want to highlight one really important feature of the circulation of ideas, which is Black print culture. Magazines like the NAACP's The Crisis, the Negro World of the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's organization. The UNIA used to print in various languages also. Présence Africaine. There's a whole series of journals, magazines, newspapers that are circulating and that make a very sustained effort to articulate, to like cover the news around the world, So, for instance, there are letters in Du Bois's archives where he writes to Gandhi and he writes to Tagore, and he says, "Will you write a message to the Negro people of America?" And he writes a short biography, a short like little description of what they're up to, and then they kind of write a short message saying, expressing solidarity and saying where the struggle in India is. So it's an incredible thing. I mean, similarly, we think of, I think it's very common to dismiss something like the Garveyite movement as a Black nationalist organization, as a Back to Africa movement. This is an organization who is deeply global in its ambition, imagination. It models itself on Sinn Féin in terms of its, like, the paper Negro World is kind of modeled on Irish World, an Irish nationalist newspaper. It sees itself as connected to struggles in Egypt and India. Garvey writes a message to Gandhi saying, me and 400 million African people are with you. So I just think there is this kind of, it is an incredible globality of vision. And I think it's an effect in some ways of being imperial subjects, right? The empire is a global formation. The British Empire is the place where the sun never sets. So you necessarily see yourself in relationship to these subjects around the world. I mean, that's not the imperial structure is not the only reason, of course. This is also the moment of the rise of especially after the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of communist internationalism, and that too, this sense of an identity formation, a vision of yourself that stretches beyond your specific location. So, on that front, on a kind of more communist side, was George Padmore's paper, The Negro Worker, which similarly just indexed the condition and character of Black work around the world. And I think, in some ways, this moment, I can only speak from the US context, there has been a revival of left literary, magazines, Jacobin being the most prominent one, and of course, complicated on the question of race for our purposes. But I think it's an important, it's a place to start. And I do think those kinds of ways of generating kind of common reading materials, literatures, might be an important thing for us to all think about.
Definitely. I want to jump a little bit back to something that Amandla mentioned, but I want to also spend some time sort of thinking about those questions that you raised. And what I wanted to go back to, and it also came up at the beginning, Adom, in your remarks about how, you know, very few of these people would describe themselves as Black internationalists. And I was wondering, I guess, the extent to which the retreat from Pan-Africanism into a sort of Black, in the way that it's described today. So obviously, for a lot of people in the sort of mid-20th century moment, or for a lot of revolutionaries in the mid-20th century moment, Black was much more expansive in its definition than what we would use today. But I was thinking about how that shift from African to Black in contemporary context also replicates a sort of shift from thinking about Africa as a continent to narrowing into sub-Saharan Africa, and excluding sort of the role of, and I find it really interesting actually, you know, having conversations with people about non-Black POC and their anti-Blackness, which seems to be a sort of dominant language in anti-racist politics at the moment. And constantly the question gets asked, like, what was ever done for us by Arabs? What was ever done for us by South Asians? What was ever done for us by, and there has been, in terms of the networks, especially in North Africa, where you have this overlap between the African world and the Arab world, the role of countries like Algeria in the formation of an African political imaginary, but also a much broader sort of global project of anti-colonialism. And when I was picking the picture for the event, actually, the first image I was going to use was an image of Kwame Toure and Miriam Makeba arriving at the Pan-African Cultural Festival in 1969. And it was as I was looking for that picture that I realized that actually just everyone was there, you know, from across the globe in Algeria, celebrating African culture in all its sort of multiplicity. And we didn't really at that point have this sense of African culture as a singular thing, and connecting that to the way in which Fanon is so, you know, he's so meticulous in talking about the importance of disaggregating African culture, or a concept of African culture, from national culture, which it has the force of the individual local struggles against a sort of ossified singular thing. And you talked earlier, Adom, about the aesthetic of Pan-Africanism. That was always something that was alive in dialogue with the context as it shifted. Whereas today I feel like we have a much narrower vision of what that is. And it, you know, I've talked about it before, but like, it just feels like it's been hollowed out of the political content. And I was wondering what you guys sort of think of those themes of the sort of shift from thinking about Africa as a whole to the sort of narrower Black sub-Saharan Africa, versus and also the sort of shift in the aesthetic of Pan-Africanism and Black politics overall.
I mean, I think there's always a tension, sorry, between those of us in the diaspora and those of us on the continent, right? And what I mean by that is that those of us in the diaspora, you know, whether that's in the Caribbean, whether that's in the UK, the US, we are much more subject to the forces of capitalism and to the forces of racism, and that kind of hierarchy of order, in a way that people on the continent are clearly not. And I think that has something to do with the way that we come to define ourselves vis-a-vis others who live on the continent. As someone from the diaspora, and I mean someone who has Caribbean roots, grew up in London and now lives in Senegal on the African continent, it's something that I've, you know, sort of become aware of. And speaking to people from the All African People's Revolutionary Party, one of the issues they really had was in making Africa the focus of their work. a lot of their focus of the work was being carried off by the sort of, the weight of, the demands within the United States, for example. And it was very difficult for them to make the focus of their work the African continent. So I think there are certain forces, that are sort of at work, with that. I think also as well on the continent, since Fanon has written, there have been different waves of national identities, which in some ways I think have served to displace or at least cover over some of the diversity on the continent. I take like Mauritania, for example, which is a country to the north of Senegal. The sort of Arab nationalism that sort of coursed through Mauritania has really served to sort of erase in some ways the Haratines or the sort of black population, which are actually the majority of the country as well. So there are certain national projects which are taking place, which I think are serving to sort of cut through ethnic groups or a sort of collective African sort of consciousness. Kwame Toure was always very adamant about defining himself as African first and foremost. That for him was his identity, even though he was a person, ironically, who sort of popularized the phrase Black Power. For him, his Africanity was really central to who he was, and he really encouraged people to use that, because for him it was an affirmation of something that was it was an affirmation. It wasn't defining yourself in relation to something else. It was an affirmation of something. So that's sort of how he looked at it himself.
Yeah, I guess I would add or say that I think one of the things about the emergence of Black internationalism as a term was precisely to move beyond what was taken in some ways to be a potential essentialism and kind of preoccupation with origins that something like Pan-Africanism suggested. It was precisely, I think, people a certain kind of more expansive imagination that may have the effect of decentering Africa, but with the purpose of sort of undoing the work of the role of like a strong foundationalist or originary commitment to the African continent. I mean, I think relatedly is the kind of way in which the institutional project of Pan-Africanism was also in decline and in crisis by the 1970s. So at the Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam, Walter Rodney says, these states tell us that they're Pan-African states, but in what sense truly are these states any different from other kind of kleptocratic, authoritarian state formations around the world? So there is this real ambivalence and ambiguity about what Pan-Africanism means by the 1970s. On the one hand, like moments like the Algiers Festival in '69, Festac in Nigeria in 1977, these are moments in which states are, funding and resourcing kind of cultural projects of Pan-Africanism. So it's not to say that these state formations are completely distant from these cultural and aesthetic projects, but there's a sense that the vision of Pan-Africanism, at least one vision of Pan-Africanism, to create a united Pan-African Federation on the African continent is not going to be realized, right? And that's true already by '63. It's definitely true by the 1970s. So there is a way in which I think it's a certain kind of failure of Pan-Africanism, of at least one version of Pan-Africanism, and this sense, as I said earlier, Black internationalism. I think of it as more of a scholarly term, and a scholarly term that came from the formation in the 90s and 2000s, which was this move, again, of distancing oneself and critiquing a certain kind of Afrocentrism and a sort of preoccupation with essentialism. I mean, I think those questions aside, the kind of contemporary conjuncture in which, at least in the North Atlantic, especially in the United States, return and resurgence of a sort of exceptionalism, I guess we could call it, a Black American exceptionalism, in which it's not just Blackness as such, but Blackness as a specific formation in the United States that is being held up as the kind of paradigmatic and exceptional form of racial oppression in the world. This is like theoretically articulated among the theorists, of course, of Afro-pessimism, and then kind of in more popular valence around the kind of movement formation called American Descendants of Slavery, or ADOS. I think those are really the convergence of the theoretical rise of Afro-pessimism and these sorts of more popular and activist formations is really interesting, I think, and I don't think I have a full account of why and how they came to emerge in this moment and together. But I think it's really important to think through why that is, and to try and think about its kind of popular uptake in this moment.
Yeah, I think if I could just also add as well, I guess what's interesting to this context is in the British context, the rise of the sort of Black British sort of definition as well. And I guess that has something to do with the fact that you have people of African Caribbean and African descent within the sort of wider Black community in the UK, but perhaps it's also partly generational as well, that you have people now who have less close links to the Caribbean or to Africa in terms of how they sort of see themselves. Adom really touched on the point. I think this was a big tension within the Pan-African movement. Sort of between you could say you had these two blocks, the Casablanca bloc, and then you had the sort of Monrovia group, basically. The Casablanca bloc being these sort of political Pan-Africanists, effectively. Your Sekou Toures, your Gamal Abdel Nassers, your Kwame Nkrumahs. And then you had the Monrovia group, which was led by Senghor. And Senghor really emphasized, being one of the sort of the high priests of negritude, he really emphasized this kind of cultural Pan-Africanism. That was really his thing. There was never really any sort of political project for Pan-Africanism. And you sort of see the legacy of that still, sort of coursing through Senegal's, sort of body politic as well. So I was just saying that, just to make the point, that Pan-Africanism to some was not purely seen as a political project, it was also seen as a purely cultural sort of project as well.
I guess maybe I feel like every time I come on here I talk about the recession of the left. I think there is something to be said of the particular kind of appeal of these politics, or cultural politics, and also the politics of exceptionalism in slightly different ways, in this moment in which there has been a recession. So when the political project collapsed of Black Marxism as like a sort of broad project of with like sort of a correlating political movement or set of militants of Pan-Africanism as a political project, as states sort of begin to capitulate on the question of newly independent states begin to capitulate on questions of internationalism and resistance to imperialism. All that is left behind is this cultural project, which is hollowed out of the political content, but also ties us back to that kind of essentialist discourse around origins that you were talking about, Adom, in which today what we see is, I mean, in the last few weeks on Twitter, I've seen like some of the craziest stuff in terms of literal, you know, paper bag testing people, of like, you know, it's become quite clear that like apparently it makes you less black if you're mixed black with like non-white, but non-black. So like if you're mixed black and Asian, you're less black than if you're mixed black and white. I've seen people say, you know, you can't refer to that person as black because they're mixed race. And I think we have, I mean, the Field Sisters talk about a resurgence of this kind of scientific racism in a different form, but how it's coming from, you know, the dominated as opposed to the, and maybe that has something to do with the way in which discourses of, I guess, redress or like after the fact, or like the way in which politics is organized around an ability to articulate a legitimate injury and get some form of, you know, restoration after that, or some form of recognition of that pain. And I feel like a lot of the politics that we have at the moment is centered on, you know, a demand to recognize what happened to us. I guess that's exemplified when, you know, in the US election or in the primary between Clinton and Sanders, Clinton, you know, some BLM activists get Clinton into a room and they're talking, and all they're sort of saying to her about the crime bill is, well, you know, how does it make you feel that you did this to Black people? You know, it's to say that, and maybe that also has something to do with the fact that we're in a moment where there is such an amnesia about colonization, about slavery. There's a sort of, coming from the right, you know, a get over it, it's already happened, it's over now. Whereas people are still living the impacts and effects of not just the historical project, but also the contemporary forms of imperialism. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit jumbled, but I guess at the sort of crux of it is we are at like, I agree with you, we're at a really interesting juncture at which the language available to us to articulate what we want from the world is so limited, but also the politics available to us to try to extend that seems to be a bit beyond our reach.
Yeah, you know, I would say, I guess, one, I think it's true that I agree with you around the language of injury, and I think you see this in a variety of contexts, not just around Black politics, but around the kind of resurgence of a kind of politics around sexual assault and rape too, that Wendy Brown has this book in the early 90s called States of Injury, and one of the essays in it is called Wounded Attachments, and it is about why and how it is that we become attached, especially when other places of politics are foreclosed, why and how we become attached to forms of identity that are built around injury and woundedness. So I think there is a real danger around that, and especially around a kind of comparative vision in which one's woundedness matters more than someone else's, or something like that. I would say, though, I think that, you know, part of why I'm interested in the figures I write about in the book, like Williams and Du Bois and Nkrumah, is because, you know, I think they are also engaged in a politics of the present that is always writing the history of the past again, right? So so it doesn't have to be that we give up on a politics of historical reckoning or a coming to terms with the past. So we don't have to go from the place in which we're stuck in our wounds to a place in which we get over it, as you know, the discourse says on the right, but a way of trying to tell histories about the past and about what the meaning of slavery and colonialism are for the present that actually opens itself up to thinking new forms of futurity. And I think all politics involves a way of making a connection between where we are, where we've been, and where we want to go. And I think And I guess, you know, the generous way of reading this moment is that you can think about it as a set of experiments, attempts at try our hand, and people trying from the argument fork in the stuck in the moment of woundedness. But I think, for instance, the articulation of a variety of projects of reparations is a kind of an experiment with a different way of trying to make a claim on the world than, say, the moment of decolonization, which really didn't have much to say about reparations as an aspiration. Yeah, I think, I mean, in some ways, I think like the challenge for us, as it has been since the end of the Cold War, is, you know, in a moment in which there isn't a kind of the structure of a kind of Soviet Communist International or a Communist Party form, how do we innovate, like both in terms of the substance of the kinds of demands we make, and the way we make the demands, and the forms of organization we articulate for ourselves? And in some ways, you can think about that. It's really, on the one hand, it's really daunting because you're like, what are we supposed to do? But on the other hand, I think it's a moment of, like, again, amazing political improvisation. You know, we talked a little bit before the show started about the movement for Black Lives as one version of this kind of experimental form that's decentralized. It's constituted by many different kinds of organizations. It's coalitional in spirit. Even though it's become so deeply associated with the killing of Black people by the police, you know, it has a vision of the world it wants beyond the end of police violence. So I think, to me, yeah, I feel kind of excited by the different forms of improvisation that are happening. And I think something that emerge from those moments of improvisation that open up paths to the future we want.
Yeah, I would add as well that the shift from the political into the sort of cultural sphere, you know, has repercussions for how we identify ourselves as well. Whereas before we would identify a Blackness as a political project, by kind of, you know, defining myself in more cultural terms, it allows for this sort of it allows for this kind of shift in definition where in many cases it's a lot harder for us to see the wider picture. I'll give you an example. We know that you know, across the world, in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, its Black Power revolution, you know, was a revolution effectively with people of African descent and of Indian descent as well, right? And that Blackness was seen as a political project to make certain demands of the you know, the sort of colonial hierarchy or that was inherited by Trinidad and Tobago at independence. And there's also, I feel as well, the sort of emphasis we have these days on sort of politics as well, where, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on, you know, on Black faces in high places, or, you know, Asian faces in high places, or you know, that sort of thing as well. And a sort of lack of collective sort of vision. I was quite interested. I've sort of been making my way through over the last few years a lot of the literature that's come out, anti-racist literature that's come out in the UK. I'm speaking as a British person now, or as a British-born person now. And you know, you've got a Carla's book, you know, Natives. You've got also Rennie Adolodge's book as well, One Talking to White People. And what was striking about it was how there was very little recognition of one of the dominant forms of state racism in the UK right now, which is Islamophobia. I mean, I can take this further. If you look at Hinde Andrews' book, he seems not to sort of even be able to sort of grasp on some of the fundamentals of, you know, to have a conversation about it. So I find that very interesting. You know, if I was to read Stuart Hall or to read Shivanandan, or some of the thinkers of the 80s, all of this would have been dealt with. But there seems to be like a sort of, a narrowing down of how we sort of look at this. And I'm starting to think as well, it's part of this also, the sort of demands of, of the market itself, the sort of demands of publishers. To sort of see, it can be quite comfortable, quite comforting actually, to sort of see Black Lives Matter as purely as pertaining to people of African descent, right? And not having a much wider sort of application. So I wonder how much we play into that as well, that sort of expectation that the Black lives only means people of African descent as well. So that's just something that I'm sort of thinking about at the moment as well.
Yeah, just to sort of add on to that, and also what you were saying, Adom, about the movement for Black Lives. I remember, so 2015 or so was when I sort of started going on Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I very quickly became, I was reading a lot of Angela Davis at the time, and I very quickly became troubled by the sense in which the conversation about police brutality was so narrow, and there were like quite prominent attempts to disaggregate police brutality from the class, content or structure, which makes more certain types of people, particularly working class people and from proletariat, more vulnerable to police brutality and violence regardless of race. And I remember seeing the movement for Black Lives platform when it was first launched, and there was a big hoo-ha afterwards about the inclusion of justice for Palestine as one of the sort of key policy demands at the time. And I remember, I think that came off the back of a trip with the Dream Defenders and BLM to Palestine shortly after Ferguson. And I guess I would agree with you that there are some really interesting sort of attempts to speak to this moment, thinking through or reckoning with what has changed between now and the 60s, what new challenges we have to being able to build a sort of global solidarity. And I guess one thing for me is that it's an example of how, thinking isn't always a good substitute for the organizational question. And a lot of the time, I think this politics of comparative injury also takes place in a context in which most people don't know what the history of, if you want to talk to I was listening to Bana Hesse on Afro-pessimism the other day, and he makes this really good point, which is that if you want to think of anti-Blackness as a structuring logic of all of modernity, then you also have to provide an account of why anti-Blackness is central to the experience of colonization or the experiences of imperialism, not just in Africa, not just in the global north, but also for South Asians, also, basically across the globe, right? And I was thinking the extent to which so many of the people who want to exceptionalize particular forms of Black injury just don't know about the experience of colonization elsewhere, just don't know in a way that we would have at the time. And I guess that poses two tasks for us, which is firstly a project of historical retrieval, to think through and recast the questions that were being asked in previous moments, so we're not trying to completely reinvent the wheel, but also a project, and I think you were really good at this, a project of narrating why it is, like, what has changed, what is different, what do we have to reckon with in this moment, so that we have a sense of what kinds of projects we need, and what kinds of ways in which we can sort of change our language, but also change the way we're doing political organizing in order to meet those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think, I also think that, the solidarity with Palestine is a really important moment. And as you say it rightly, it's a starting moment. It hasn't built necessarily all the infrastructural networks that connect one place to another. I mean, I will say, I think this is probably true of the UK, but it is especially true of the United States. It is also very easy to, living in the most powerful country in the world, it's very easy to be insular, right? There is a way in which, and Gary Young had a great article in the New York Review of Books about the meaning of Black America for Europe. It came out in Ryan uprisings were happening, and it's a quote from Malcolm X he has in there, in which Malcolm X says, you know, the African Americans don't recognize the ways in which their struggle resonates with people around the world. They can't, and it's like what it means to live in the empire, like to be in the belly of the beast, is that you don't turn on the news and hear about the rest of the world. You just hear about what's happening here all the time. I grew up on the African continent, and it is very disorienting, you know, because you're habituated to thinking about the world beyond. I think one other thing I was going to say, and I mean, I want to say this as tentatively as possible because I'm not really sure. And as I said, I think the Black Palestine connection and efforts at solidarity are really important. But I also wonder about how the languages we use, say the fact that the like analysis of the Israeli state as an apartheid state really cognizes a form of racial struggle that we know, like it names a kind of black-white binary that's very clear to us. It makes that kind of struggle perhaps more resonant than other kinds of struggle, the struggle of Kashmiris who have lost their, autonomy, the struggle of Black Haitians against Black Dominican, in a Black state like the Dominican Republic. The context of the African continent, where again, for most of the continent, there are kind of struggles that can't be cognized in the same sorts of racial frameworks, right? So I think it's also building vocabularies of, I'm a scholar, so I'm always doing the thinking part, and this is not to say that what your very important point about building organizational structures, I don't want to leave that behind, but I think our ability to build organizational structures depends on our real ability to understand these struggles and to be able to make meaningful connections to them, even when they don't look like our struggles, right? They don't take the same form as struggles we are familiar with. And so I think, that's a real open question for me. And I think the movement for Black Lives has done other kinds of delegations to Brazil and to South Africa too. So it's not just Palestine, but I think again, these Brazil and South Africa, again, as histories of like particular kinds of racial states, they're ones that resonate quite closely with so I want to reiterate again the necessity of thinking about alternative fora for articulating visions of global struggle.
I would also want to bring in the issue of language as well, which I think is important. And then perhaps there's also Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. If you get that far, but the truth is that West Africa is dominated by francophone countries, places like Burkina Faso, by Senegal, and by Mali. And when I say francophone, I don't mean that everyone speaks French, but those are the official languages. They have their own languages, and we have to recognize that as well. And when we talk about things like solidarity, I always find it striking how there are just these kind of separate sort of spheres that we sort of like lock into, and which don't seem to penetrate across these sort of linguistic barriers. And I think that's something we really have to like sort of think about when it comes to thinking about solidarity, thinking about Pan-Africanism, and thinking about even our own ideas of what what African is and means. One of the interesting things I came across about Conakry, the capital of Guinea, during the 70s, was the fact that it was home to Nkrumah. Ghana was the first Anglophone country in sub-Saharan Africa to get its independence. It's also the country, Conakry is the capital of Guinea, which is ruled by Sékou Toure, who is obviously, former French colony. But it's also, a haven for Amilcar Cabral, who is running the liberation war against the Portuguese next door in Guinea-Bissau as well. So Conakry is also a model for a sort of, a translingual sort of, African solidarity. And I think that's something we need to also think about as well when it comes to, we need to interrogate our sort of geographies, about the world as well, and take them beyond linguistic zones.
Thanks so much. So I'm conscious of timing, and we're now at 25 to. So what I was going to do is I was just going to give you both an opportunity to give any sort of closing remarks. I know it feels a bit abrupt, my apologies, and then I can wrap up for us. Just to say on the chat that the reason we haven't is just because we started a bit late, and so we were running late on time, but definitely I want to continue this conversation. The video is going to be going up, and we'll be responding, or I'll be responding at least, to questions if you post them in the comment section, and hopefully we'll be able to keep the conversation going. So I'll start with Adom.
Okay, it's hard to wrap up really, because we've been so many places in this conversation. So thanks for this. It's been really fun to do it. Yeah, I don't know how to really wrap up, except to say, I think, I want to reiterate this question about like how we learn from the past, and try to say that one of the things I think, again, the moment of decolonization teaches us is it's really easy to look from our vantage point and be like, man, like that time was awesome. They had they still had socialism. They kind of lived in this kind of ideal moment for revolution. But if you go back and look at 1945, when World War II ended, and all of these nationalists are beginning to think about the formation of nationalist parties, they're thinking about how they might go about securing independence. It's really important to remember at that moment, like the 1960, when 17 African states would gain independence, when they'd be in the process of trying to create an organization of African states, none of that looked like it was going to be on the horizon in 15 years, right? And so I think that's really important to not feel. It's really easy to feel hopeless in some ways about our moment. I often too, especially from where I sit in the United States. But I think it's really important to think about the fact that even for that generation of activists who would become sort of central to the 1960s moment, there was nothing guaranteed or given in advance that something like that could happen. So then the question for us is, it's not to say that we are 15 years out from global revolution, but it's just to say that how might we think about what are the places that we have resources and a critical mass of people, et cetera, the kind of intellectual but also organizational infrastructure, and how might we build and strengthen on those places with the kind of capacity to keep a certain kind of political hope alive and an orientation to a certain kind of flexibility, because it's not clear to me standing right now where there may be political openings that we can't know in advance.
Yeah, and I'm going to sort of come off the back of that, and the lessons that I've drawn are really from Kwame Toure and the AAPRP, so the 70s and 80s. At the time, I guess, has some similarities to our sort of moment. And I guess, I think as we do what Adom says, we start to organize, we start to think, we need to also listen to the continent and the African continent. I think that's really, really important. And begin to see it on its own terms, and in its sort of, bewildering sort of diversity as well. We need to be incorporating African thinkers. Pan-Africanists in the West need to be talking to those on the continent. I think that's really key. And I think that it's quite easy for us to operate in our own little bubbles in London, in New York, or wherever, and feel like we're saving the continent when we have no connection with the continent whatsoever, or only have a very sort of a particular connection. So I think that's really, really key and really important, that we have to sort of look outside the sort of romanticization, essentialization of Africa and try to see it on its own terms. I think as well that, again, taking a lesson from Kwame Toure, Kwame Toure saw himself as an organizer first and foremost, right? And we would need to move from mobilization to organization. We need to think about political education, forming and building networks and alliances. It can't just sort of be marches here and there sporadically. There has to be something which is, more sort of deeply rooted. And I wanted to really just end with a sort of quote from Toure. This is from 1995, and he's looking across the continent of Africa and seeing one counter-revolutionary setback after another. And he says, there was very little good news. The reports coming into Conakry from the cadres in the field, as well as from allies in the continent, were almost all grim. Month and month, report and report, there were setbacks. He talks about, neoliberalism brazenly resurfacing and arrogant military dictatorships puffing themselves up, normalizing opportunism, naked corruption, and greed. And he puts part of this down to the delayed effects of the demise of the Soviet Union. And then he says, in the liberation struggles of Africans and all oppressed and exploited peoples, some unfolded over generations, even centuries. There are low points and reverses. That's all. The struggle continues.
Thank you so much to both of you. So much to think with in this conversation. I'm going to be putting the video up on YouTube tonight, or tomorrow morning. I just wanted, again, to say thank you to you both. Thank you to everybody who joined us. And yes, the struggle will continue, hopefully. No, definitely. I think that's the only sure thing that we have. All right, so with that, I'm going to bid farewell to everybody and see you again in 2 weeks.